Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a period in American history that, well, it often feels like a tangled knot. The tumultuous road to the Civil War.
It really does. So much going on.
Exactly. And our mission today, looking at the articles and notes you've shared, is to unravel a core truth of this era, what we're calling the inevitable failure of compromise. We'll explore how these repeated attempts, to find some kind of middle ground on slavery, they didn't just fall short, they actually backfired, pushing the nation towards conflict.
That's right. What we'll really drill down into today is how national leaders, legislators, even the courts tried again and again to resolve this escalating question of slavery, especially as America kept expanding westward.
Right, that expansion seems key.
It is. But, as our sources vividly illustrate, these efforts, far from bringing peace, actually inflamed tensions. They accelerated the nation's slide into war. So our goal is to highlight the pivotal moments that really demonstrate this tragic pattern, giving you a clearer understanding of not just what happened, but why these specific failures proved so catastrophic.
So let's delve into this. What really stands out in our materials is how a series of major events, specific laws, critical court decisions, even outright violence, each one served to prove that political solutions were just inadequate. They couldn't contain this growing crisis.
Yeah, this system was buckling.
Think of it as a shortcut, maybe, to understanding why the very concept of compromise ultimately buckled under the weight of such an intractable, deeply rooted issue.
Absolutely. It was becoming clear that some issues maybe can't be compromised on.
Our sources make it abundantly clear that the relentless acquisition of new lands in the West was, well, the primary engine driving this conflict.
Every single time.
Every single new territory acquired just continuously reignited that burning question. Would slavery be permitted there? It wasn't just an issue, it was like a wound that kept getting torn open.
And what's particularly striking in the materials is how even the Compromise of 1850, which some people at the time thought was this grand solution, right?
Yeah, the final settlement.
Exactly. But retrospectively, it's described as merely a Band-Aid on the gushing neck wound of America's abject regional division over the issue of slavery.
Wow, that's vivid.
It really is. That potent imagery underscores that the underlying problem was just too severe, too fundamental for any quick political fix. It wasn't something you could just paper over.
That's such a powerful image, and it certainly sticks with you. And speaking of things that didn't stick, or rather unraveled a previous agreement, let's turn our attention to one of the most significant and, frankly, utterly disastrous failed compromises, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This seems to be a real linchpin in our sources.
It absolutely is a major turning point. This act, championed by Senator Stephen Douglas, is a prime example of the breakdown we're talking about.
Okay, how so?
Well, it essentially wiped out the Missouri Compromise of 1820, just got rid of it.
The one that had stood for decades.
That's the one. And it did this by introducing popular sovereignty into the Kansas and Nebraska territories.
Popular sovereignty. So the people there decide.
Exactly. What this meant was that the residents of these territories, the settlers, not Congress back in Washington, would make the decision about whether slavery would be legal there or not.
Reading through our notes, the significance of overturning the Missouri Compromise really hits home. That 36-degree, 30-iota line, it had prohibited slavery in that huge northern section of the Louisiana Purchase for over 30 years.
A long time. Felt settled to many.
Right. And Northerners who had clung to that 1820 compromise with, as one source puts it, exceeding tenacity as a bedrock of sectional peace, they were, quite understandably, absolutely furious. How critical was that reaction?
Oh, it was catastrophic. Just explosive. The immediate bloody consequence was Bleeding Kansas.
Bleeding Kansas, even the name.
Tells you a lot, doesn't it? The act directly sparked violent clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. Each side was desperate to control the territory's destiny, to make sure their side won the popular sovereignty vote.
So people rushed in.
They did. And our sources detail events like the fraudulent election of 1855. You had thousands of pro-slavery Missourians, the so-called border ruffians, flooding across the border just to cast illegal votes.
Wow, blatant fraud.
Totally blatant. And this brazen act just escalated the violence dramatically. It led to the establishment of two rival state legislatures, one pro-slavery, one anti-slavery.
So total chaos.
Complete chaos.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just some political squabble. It was like a preview, a miniature version of the larger conflict to come. It showcased that compromise, especially this kind of compromise, just couldn't contain these incredibly deep sectional tensions anymore.
And beyond the bloodshed, The act was a true catalyst for a fundamental reshaping of national politics, wasn't it? It's credited directly with the collapse of the Whig Party.
Yes. And the rapid rise of the Republican Party. It irrevocably shattered the existing political alignment, the trust between North and South. It made future compromise on this issue all but impossible. It's hard to overstate its impact, really.
So as legislative efforts like the Kansas-Nebraska Act fractured the nation, the conflict wasn't just contained to Congress or the territories, it started bleeding into everyday life, right? And the direct enforcement of federal laws really deepened the chasm. The Anthony Burns trial of 1854 is a stark example our sources highlight.
It is. This was a highly public, very emotionally charged instance of the federal government rigorously enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850.
Part of that earlier compromise.
Exactly. Anthony Burns, an escaped enslaved man, was captured in Boston, a real hotbed of abolitionist sentiment. His trial and his forced return to slavery, which was protected by federal troops, a massive public demonstration of federal power. It enraged not just Northern abolitionists, but even many moderates who were just appalled by what they saw.
And our materials mention that many Northerners saw this as proof of slave power. Can you elaborate on what exactly that term meant to them? Why did they view the federal government as enforcing it?
Absolutely. Slave power was this term, widely used in the North, to describe what they perceived as a kind of powerful conspiracy.
A conspiracy.
Yeah, by Southern politicians and wealthy slaveholders to dominate federal policy, to protect slavery, and crucially, to expand it even into free territories or states where it hadn't been.
Okay.
So the Anthony Burns trial, with federal troops literally marching through the streets of Boston to return a human being to bondage, that was seen as undeniable evidence of this slave power controlling the federal government itself. It deepened Northern resentment, not just against the South, but against the very compromise of 1850 that included that Fugitive Slave Act. It felt like the federal government was actively choosing sides against fundamental freedoms.
The tensions truly escalated then, from laws and court rulings to actual physical violence right inside the halls of Congress. This is epitomized by that shocking assault on Charles Sumner in 1856. I mean, this wasn't just a debate gone wrong. It was a physical blow to the whole idea of democratic discourse.
Indeed. It was shocking. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, a very staunch abolitionist, delivered this fiery speech called The Crime Against Kansas.
Okay.
In it, he didn't just announce pro-slavery forces, he also got very personal, insulting Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So in a shocking act of retaliation, Representative Preston Brooks, who was Butler's relative, walked onto the Senate floor a couple days later and just brutally beat Sumner with a heavy cane. Sumner was seated at his desk, unable to defend himself properly.
On the Senate floor, it's almost hard to imagine today. This act of violence right there in Congress, it symbolized an absolute collapse of civility in politics, didn't it?
Completely. And the reaction was so polarized. Northerners saw Sumner as a martyr, suffering for the cause of freedom. But many Southerners glorified Brooks as a hero who had defended Southern honor. It just starkly highlighted how hardened and personal the sectional hostility had become. Passions were so high that even the supposed sanctity of Congress couldn't hold.
It showed the divide wasn't just political anymore.
Exactly. And that's a crucial insight from our sources. This wasn't just an isolated incident of one guy losing his temper. It reflected this deep, deep chasm in values and perceptions that extended far beyond those individuals.
But perhaps the most jarring, the most utterly destructive blow to any remaining hope of compromise, it came from the Supreme Court itself, the Dred Scott decision of 1857. This wasn't a law debated by a divided Congress. This was supposed to be the definitive final word from the highest court.
Right. And instead, it threw gasoline on the fire. This landmark case involved Dred Scott, an enslaved man. He sued for his freedom based on the fact that he'd lived for years with his master in free territories, places like Illinois and Wisconsin.
Makes sense, right? If you live in a free place.
Logically, yes.
Yeah.
But Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, who was a Southern Democrat, delivered this incredibly controversial ruling that, as our sources explain, had just enormous and far-reaching implications. It essentially nullified decades of political attempts at trying to find some resolution.
And the court's declaration was just chilling. It stated that African Americans, whether they were enslaved or free, were not citizens at all, and therefore they had no right to sue in federal court.
Correct. That was the first part. But it went even further than that, didn't it?
It did. It stated that Congress had no authority whatsoever to ban slavery in the territories. None. which effectively made slavery legal, potentially, in all U.S. territories.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the court's reasoning was based on property rights under the Constitution.
How so?
Well, they argued the Constitution prohibits Congress from depriving any citizen of property without due process. And if enslaved people were legally considered property, which was the Southern view, then slave owners could take their property anywhere, including into federal territories.
So that invalidated the Missouri Compromise line.
Completely invalidated it. And obviously, this decision deeply angered Northerners. It convinced many that the slave power conspiracy wasn't just influencing Congress, but it now fully captured the federal judiciary as well.
Right.
The practical effect was devastating for Compromise. It essentially opened any territory, and by extension, maybe even free states eventually, to slavery. It completely undermined every previous legislative effort to contain its expansion and left virtually no room for any further political compromise on the issue. Where do you go from there?
So when we look back at Stephen Douglas's role, the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it seems pretty clear his intentions to somehow resolve the conflict just wildly missed the mark. He aimed for a solution, but ended up causing more chaos.
That's a key takeaway for the material, definitely. Douglas, it seems, genuinely hoped popular sovereignty would diffuse the sectional conflict, take the issue out of Congress's hands, let the settlers decide, allow for smooth westward expansion. That was the plan.
But it didn't work out that way.
Not even close.
Yeah.
Instead, as our sources chronicle, his policy directly led to the violence of Bleeding Kansas. It utterly destroyed National Party unity, especially by splitting the Northern and Southern Democrats. And his famous debates with Abraham Lincoln in 1858 just further highlighted these deep, irreconcilable divisions over slavery that really no amount of political maneuvering or attempts at compromise would bridge anymore. He became a symbol, in a way, of a well-intentioned but ultimately disastrously failed attempt to keep the Union together through politics.
Given all these escalating conflicts, then, the legislative failures like Kansas-Nebraska, the judicial pronouncements like Dred Scott, the outright violence like the Sumner beating, what did this all mean for the actual structure of American politics? Our sources really emphasize how it led to a fundamental restructuring, what they call the collapse of the second party system and the rise of sectional parties.
Yeah, this is where we see the political landscape just utterly transformed. The Whig Party was the first major casualty. It just couldn't bridge the profound sectional divisions within its own ranks.
Too much pressure.
Exactly. It effectively collapsed after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, splitting into factions like the Cotton Whigs in the South, who supported slavery, and the Conscience Whigs in the North, who opposed it. It simply couldn't hold together.
And in its place, the Republican Party emerged pretty quickly in the North, right around 1854.
That's right. And this wasn't a monolithic party either, but a really diverse coalition. It attracted former Know-Nothings members of that nativist party focused on anti-immigrant sentiment.
Right, the anti-immigrant party.
Yeah, but also abolitionists, free soilers who just wanted to stop slavery's spread, not necessarily end it everywhere, and those anti-slavery conscience Whigs. It was a real mix.
And their main platform.
While they didn't initially advocate for abolishing slavery where it already existed, they were absolutely united and dedicated to stopping its expansion into any new Western territories. Full stop.
And how was that dedication perceived in the South?
Well, that dedication was seen by Southerners, and particularly the Southern Democrats, as an existential threat, a fundamental threat to the institution of slavery everywhere, eventually.
Even if the Republicans said they wouldn't touch it in the South?
Even then, the fear was containment would eventually lead to extinction. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party itself became increasingly polarized and split regionally. Northern Democrats, like Stephen Douglas, found their influence waning. They were overshadowed by Southern pro-slavery fire eaters.
Fire eaters.
Yeah, those were the really radical secessionists who were actively advocating for the South's immediate withdrawal from the Union. So what you ended up with were fewer national parties trying to find common ground and more distinct opposing regional parties with basically irreconcilable platforms.
We also briefly saw those nativist movements, like the Know-Nothing Party you mentioned, gain some traction for a bit. But it seems the issue of slavery just ultimately overshadowed everything else. It became the defining, all-consuming issue of the era.
It really did. It sucked all the oxygen out of the room for other political issues.
So as you've just explored in this deep dive, these various compromises, things intended to mend a rapidly dividing nation instead acted almost like accelerants on a fire.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
From legislative acts like Kansas-Nebraska to court decisions like Dred Scott and even that outright violence in the halls of Congress, each attempt to find some kind of middle ground on slavery only seemed to push America closer and closer to civil war.
What this deep dive truly reveals, I think, is a tragic progression. You see these efforts to contain a fundamental moral and economic conflict, but they only end up highlighting its irreconcilable nature. The idea that knowledge is most valuable when understood and applied is crucial here. Understanding these failures isn't just about dates and names from the past.
Right.
It's about grasping the immense weight of fundamental disagreements that ultimately just had no easy political solution available at the time.
Which raises an important question, I think, for you, our listeners, to consider. If even multiple, seemingly earnest attempts at compromise by national leaders, by the highest court in the land, if all that failed to address such a core societal division, what does that tell us about the limits of political solutions when faced with truly unyielding, deeply held beliefs?
Hmm. That's the core question, isn't it?
It's a thought that resonates far beyond the 1850s, I think. It urges us to examine the foundational issues, maybe even in our own time, that seem to defy easy answers or simple compromises.